Hey, I'm Tamara Kandaker, and you're listening to The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. So universities are often thought of as very progressive institutions where equity, the freedom from bias, is a fundamental value. But when it comes to the pay and power gap between men and women, it turns out in Canada, they're not much better than many other public institutions. In fact, they're actually some of the worst offenders.
So when I was hired in 2000, I was the only Black woman in science, technology, engineering, mathematics fields on my campus. And that's still true.
Mady-Ann Andrade is a professor at the University of Toronto Scarborough and the president of the Black Canadian Scientists Network. When she started out 2 decades ago, only 11% of full professors at U of T were women, even though women have outnumbered men at universities for 3 decades and have been earning master's degrees at a higher rate since 1995. In 2021, there are still more men in higher earning positions, and the wage gap has actually increased. Now, Mady-Ann spends about a third of her time working to fix this and educating people about how research funding, promotions, and hiring can all be influenced by unconscious bias.
One of the things that's really interesting about being involved in these efforts is that when you have a targeted effort, on the one side, some people say, well, it's no longer about excellence. All you're doing is looking for women or looking for women of color. And really, there is a hidden racism and sexism in that statement because it assumes that, in fact, that there aren't people who are excellent who are not receiving these things otherwise because of exclusion, because of biases.
My colleagues Robyn Doolittle and Chen Wang have been working on an investigative series called Power Gap. They've been looking at gender inequities in the modern workforce.
There's this whole ecosystem in academia that makes it hard for women to succeed.
Robyn's on the show today to talk about the biases women in academia deal with and why progress at universities has basically stalled. Let's get into it. Hey, Robyn.
Hey, Tamara.
Thank you for coming on the show. I've been so excited to have you on.
I am so excited to be on. Congratulations on the amazing launch of The Decibel.
Thank you. Okay, so we're talking today about the latest installment of your Power Gap series. So this investigation on the university sector is part of a bigger series that you've been working on called Power Gap. You've been looking at the gender gap in both pay and power across many different sectors in Canada. But why focus on universities?
Yeah, so just to back up a bit, earlier this year, we launched the series. And what we've done is we collected public sector salary records. These are known as sunshine lists from hundreds of institutions across the country. And when we looked at the data, what really shocked us was that universities stood out as among the worst in the country when it came to gender, in terms of their overall numbers, but also the number of women in high-paying jobs, the number of women in leadership. What was so striking about universities' poor track record is that these institutions are so important in this country. They not only educate the next generation, but they decide how this country sees itself. They decide what issues are worthy of study. They decide who does that research. They are one of the primary employers in many communities. After the series ran, we heard from a lot of universities that said, like, oh, we're working on this. Like, we have these policies. We're going to diversify staff. We're doing this right now. I went back, through the Globe archives, as I love to do, into the 80s and 90s. And there's just constant stories about universities promising to do better. There's the announcement of campaigns to hire more women. There's government funding going out purely to hire more women faculty. Universities vowing, okay, this is the time we're going to change. The 80s finished, the 90s finished, the 2000s finished. We're now into the 2020s and things still haven't improved. And that made us want to dig deeper.
So how did you go about looking at pay equity in universities in Canada? How did you do that research?
So when my colleague Chen Wang and I started doing this work several years ago, what we really wanted to see was how this gender imbalance had progressed over time. Ontario makes its public sector salary disclosure public going back 20 years. So we collected these sunshine lists and analyzed them and married them with statistics around the gender probability of first names. And that's how we were able to come up with this. We looked at the overall trend in the university sector. But then we're also making data for individual universities available. And I think it is worth noting that some schools were just too small to include in the analysis. So we were able to use 15 universities in Ontario, but anyone that didn't have 100 employees on their sunshine list as of 2009 couldn't be included. The numbers were just too small to be meaningful. We did also adjust for inflation between 1999 and today so that we are comparing apples to apples when it comes to looking at salaries.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so give me a broad overview. What were the key findings of your investigation?
20 years ago, women accounted for about 1 in 10 university employees on the Sunshine List. Now it's about a third. This is obviously an improvement, but that still means about 2/3 of employees are men. The wage gap over that period has actually increased by 5 percentage points. This is because women are primarily being hired into and staying in lower paying, less prestigious jobs. We also looked at the gender divide in specific jobs. So we looked at assistant professor, associate professor, full professor, dean, vice president, et cetera. This just really highlights it. What we've seen is this explosion in the number of women being hired into the assistant ranks, which happens to be the least paid and least prestigious with the least job security. That's about 50-50 today. But they're not making it up to the professor level. That level is still about 2/3 men. And when you look at more senior roles like assistant vice president, it's a very similar story. You've got 70% of women as assistant vice presidents, but only 40% as vice presidents.
Okay, so basically, in summary, lots of very accomplished female scholars in the system, but they're just getting stuck in this pipeline. And we'll get into more specifics about what's actually happening. But how did you account for race and other intersectionalities that may factor into the pay gap and the power gap in your research?
Yeah, the sad fact is that unfortunately the only way that we could look at this data was through gender. We married public sector salary records with statistics on the probability of gender associated with first names. It's not possible to look at these lists and account for race or disability or LGBTQ plus status, but we did try to fill out those experiences by interviewing a diverse range of academics from a diverse range of backgrounds.
Right. So there's an interesting fact in your piece that I wanted to highlight, which is that 20 years ago, even though women professors were outnumbered by men, there was almost no gender wage gap. But now there is a gap of about 5%.
That was such a really interesting thing that jumped out at us in this research. So 20 years ago, women accounted for something like 1 in 10 university employees on the Sunshine List. And those women were evenly distributed throughout the salary band. So there was about 12% at the top, there was about 12% at the bottom. So the wage gap was essentially zero. Today, women are dramatically concentrated in the lower paying, less prestigious jobs. And that's created this imbalance that is dragging down the average wage of women. But I think what you're getting at is a really interesting point that we're trying to, I think, change the conversation a bit with the Power Gap series. By focusing solely on money, you're missing the full picture. And what we know is that women are underrepresented in decision-making roles and leadership roles in the more prestigious jobs at universities.
So you wrote about how one of the challenges that female academics are up against is this societal bias that sees them as teachers while men are seen as professors. What does that mean? And what are the implications of that?
So women in academia face all of the same barriers that women in other sectors do. We're talking about, work interruptions with maternity leave. They're taking on the bulk of unpaid care work at home, just general feelings of sexism that exist in society. But women academics have this unique anchor on them, which is that people view women as teachers and men as professors. I was actually reading a report about gender imbalances in universities that was written like 20 or 30 years ago. I think it was by StatsCan, and it referred to women faculty as university teachers. Like that just kind of, I thought, drove home this point to me. So this feeling that women are not natural professors or scientists just permeates every aspect of a woman's career in academia. So it impacts the student evaluations that they get, which universities use these student evaluations to make decisions around promotion and tenure. It impacts their ability to climb within their institutions, to build relationships with colleagues, to get published, to get grants. And it's just this compounding effect that really drags down their careers.
Mm-hmm. And when we talk about the difference between a teacher and a professor, we're talking about, like, I guess, research, right? Men are seen as teachers who also are doing like very serious academic research.
I think it's even more simple than that. I think it's people see a woman and see a kindergarten teacher. And I think people see men, you picture a professor, and I'm picturing a guy in a bad corduroy blazer with leather patches and Harry Potter glasses. I think that that's just what it is that women, I guess wrapped up in that bias would be women aren't as smart or as capable of handling these complex things.
Yeah. So research is obviously part of what an academic does, but explain why publishing research is an important part of an academic's career trajectory. So how much money they make and whether they get promotions, et cetera.
Over and over again, I heard about the challenges of getting published. Research has shown that women have a harder time getting published than men. And why this is so important is that getting your research published as an academic is like your whole currency. When universities get their name in the paper for a big discovery, it's not because this professor's really killing it, right? It's that they've made a discovery, they're leading the field in this, they're breaking new ground. That's where the money is, that's where the prestige is. So there's a lot of value on research. There's this whole ecosystem in academia that makes it hard for women to succeed. Women, when they're starting out, get fewer resources from their institutions. Women have a harder time winning grants. Women have a harder time building relationships with male colleagues to work collaboratively on work. But men are more likely to be in the more prestigious jobs that have the funding and the resources. Universities allocate research space based on the number of grants that you win. So if you're doing well, you get more. And so this is just really a cascading effect. At the end of it, women have a harder time getting their research published. This is a key measure that universities use to evaluate success. So the more work you get published, the easier it is to get grants, the easier it is to get resources, the easier it is to attract grad students, to get more research, to get more funding, to get more published, et cetera. And you can see how this cycle just starts to spin, and women are having a harder time breaking into it than men. And this is how, over the course of a career, this compounding effect really starts to slow women down.
I know universities also look at student evaluations when they're considering whether or not to promote a professor or, whether to give them more funding. Can you tell me about that? Like, how seriously do universities take course evaluations that students do at the end of a semester?
Student evaluations are a huge issue of contention. Just to give you an idea, in 2018, Ontario arbitrator William Kaplan made this precedent-setting decision against Ryerson University that declared the university could no longer use student evaluations when considering promotion or tenure. And he basically said, the evidence is very clear, and it's actually uncontested in this hearing, that numerous factors, especially personal traits and characteristics like race and gender and accent, age, attractiveness, that they skew these results. Students are harder on women, on racialized staff. And yet universities across the country are still using these cases.
How do universities themselves explain the wage and power gaps?
So the first story ran in January, and we surveyed all 82 universities that were included in that analysis. You can read all the responses on our website. But what I thought was interesting is a lot of them sounded very defensive. Universities say that, change takes a lot of time, that they have policies, that they're working on this issue. And there has been progress. I just want to, underscore that it is better. What was really interesting is the story wasn't entirely the same everywhere. There were some exceptions. We looked at Laurier University, for example, which has made huge gains in the number of women in its highest salary echelons. And I interviewed the president, who happens to be one of the few women university presidents in the country, Deborah McLatchie. And she was reluctant, she's a scientist, to say exactly why they've done well because they haven't properly studied the issue, but she had some theories. One of them was that the university has a policy against kind of negotiation. They come up with a number that they're willing to pay staff. And if the candidate and the university can't agree, then they're willing to walk away. Laurier has had a huge boom in the number of students and therefore hiring. So they've had a chance to hire a lot of new staff. And she said this has been really key because it's likely that when we're talking about who's leaving the workforce, people who are retiring, they're older white men, and the people being hired are more diverse candidates.
I just want to wrap by going back to what we were talking about at the beginning, which is why you zoomed in on the university sector and how important it is to what we think is important in this country and how Canada sees itself, and the fact that universities are producing the next generation of leaders. What are the consequences of this gender power gap in academia for the public?
I think something that we've been trying to do with this series is really highlight the consequences of not having women in decision-making roles and in positions of power, in prestigious jobs. When you look at universities, the implications are really scary because when you don't have women at the table, that's how you end up, coming up with Viagra and not something that can cure menstrual cramps, right? Women are more likely to get hurt in car accidents. And part of that story is that the crash test dummy is designed in the shape of a man. Historically, the crash test dummy was designed as a male body. I heard over and over again from women academics who were looking into issues that had gender implications, that were told that this wasn't important, that we're not going to look at this, that if you study this issue, you're not going to get tenure. Think of all that we could know that we don't because those women were dissuaded from pursuing this.
Okay, Robyn, thank you so much. This was very, very interesting.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
That's it for today. I'm Tamara Kandaker. Our producers are Madeline White and Kasia Mihailovich. David Crosby edits the show. Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thanks so much to Robyn Doolittle as well as Professor Madiane Andrade. If you like this episode, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. If you want to say hello or let us know what you want us to cover next, you can email us at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. And most importantly, wherever you listen to podcasts, hit that follow button so you never miss an episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.